when you have attachment trauma, your basic level of safety and trust is severely disrupted.
Complex trauma is not even in the DSM. Even in the course of my training, like it was more superficial or like did not take into consideration like generational patterns and the cultural context. My practice very quickly filled with highly anxious, overthinking overachievers. So they would come in for like anxiety and perfectionism, and we'd like address those symptoms. Before we know it, it'd be like, oh no, this is complex trauma.
Today, we'd like to welcome as our guest Dr. Han Ren. Dr. Han Ren is a licensed psychologist, consultant, speaker, and educator. Her work is deeply rooted in liberation and anti-oppressive mental health practices. Dr. Ren addresses the pursuit of collective healing through her work centered on historically overlooked communities, especially Asian Americans and children of immigrants. She practices from a justice-oriented, interpersonal, culturally humble, and systems-informed framework. Through her widely viewed content on social media, Dr. Ren strives to make mental health accessible and applicable to our daily lives. She has been featured on TEDx stages, the Headspace app, BuzzFeed, and Huffington Post. Welcome, Dr. Ren.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. And I thought, let's just get started. I'd love to hear about how you decided to go into the field of psychology and also what it's been like to be a psychologist as a person, a queer person of color. What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah. I think when it comes to therapy, especially, most of us find our ways into this field because of some sort of reckoning with our own personal trauma or family trauma, historic or systemic trauma. It's some sort of attempt to make sense of our experiences and those of our people and better understand and experience some healing, and then also share that with other people who have similar origins. So for me, I grew up in a kind of, I grew up with a lot of attachment trauma in that I had had four different caregivers by the time I was 5 years old. So my parents left me in China. I was born in China. My parents left me to come to the US. I was also cared for by like some neighbors for a few months when I was like a baby. And then when I was 5, I came to the US to join my parents, but my grandparents stayed in China. And so I had a lot of attachment disruptions growing up that really messed up, my internal sense of safety and trust and belonging and all of these things that I always felt like something's not right here. I don't feel good ever. And so growing up in that environment and feeling really just off made me super curious about psychology and the mind and why everything felt so wrong to me as a child. So when I grew older, that was something I really wanted to explore, not just for myself, but for, my family. Just generationally, these things kind of perpetuate. And then, learning more about like the immigration story and cultural context and like the amount of stigma that really exists in communities of color, I really wanted to work to heal my people and be part of the forces that could destigmatize this, and allow for more, open conversations, dialogue, and healing around emotional pains and generational curses. And as for being a person of color, a queer person of color, I think that's, even more impetus to do this work because it's so necessary and underrepresented. And there remains so much cultural stigma and pride in communities of color that make mental health more taboo and healing less accessible.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, it sounds like it's interesting. You do hear a lot about stories of people who go into psychology, as you had said, trying to make meaning out of their own experiences and also heal. Interestingly, I also came from a childhood background with lots of trauma, attachment trauma, but very different. My parents, both of them, pretty damaged people themselves,
Yeah.
were really challenged with parenting and just inaccessible and unavailable. And my paternal grandmother did a lot of my raising of me.
Yes.
And I was left a lot. Like my parents would leave me at my grandmother's. I didn't know when they were going to come back. So you and I share some similarities in our background in terms of that sense of not feeling safe. Like when you have attachment trauma, and, this is helpful for the listeners to hear, that when you have attachment trauma, your basic level of safety and trust is severely disrupted. So we go through the world with this blueprint, or almost like a background, like background noise, that, that sense of not feeling safe. And I'm kind of curious how that translates for you, not only as a person of color and as a queer person. How did that translate for you, even with your experience, your training, being in spaces, like mental health spaces, and bringing that to the table? How did that create your own personal filters around the experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's so layered, right? Because, like, on the one hand, when you start this journey of learning about healing, you learn about, like, oh, anxiety and depression and like symptoms and behavioral activation and all of these ways to address symptoms and presentation. And even in the research and the literature, like complex trauma is not even in the DSM yet. It's in the ICD, but like it's still relatively new. And so, it felt really affirming to like, wow, okay, so these experiences that I've had are not necessarily normal, or I shouldn't just, grin and bear it. Like I deserve some relief and so do others. But then even in the course of my training, like I always felt like it was more superficial, or like did not take into consideration like the generational patterns and the cultural context and systems of power and oppression that affect, the experiences of people who are marginalized, and the immigration story, and like, just the immigration mentality, right? Like everything that comes along with that when it comes to scarcity and hustling and never resting. And, you have to internalize such a capitalistic sense in order to leave everything for survival, right? And then that gets translated to the next generation. So it felt really affirming on one hand, but it felt incomplete on the other. And that was really what I wanted to kind of bridge in bringing more of that like cultural context, that generational context, and that layers of how your identity affect how you approach healing, how you're able to access it.
Yeah, as you said, it's very complex, multi-layered, layered and
Yeah,
nuanced, isn't it? It's
totally.
interesting. It's interesting. I suspect that there's there's a generation between us. I
Mm.
remember one of my last conferences I attended as a graduate student. So I was just about out the door with my PhD, and I went to see, or he came to Denver, was Bessel van der Kolk.
Oh
And
yeah.
this was before anybody really knew Bessel van der Kolk. This was like in 1992. And the
Wow.
idea of, even they didn't even call it complex trauma at that
Yeah.
point. What he was doing was he was taking PTSD from veterans and translating it into other human experiences. So as I'm leaving graduate school in 1992, just this idea of trauma for the quote average person was just being introduced. So it wasn't introduced as complex trauma. You know, you go through training, and I know when I went through training, you know, therapy, there was a big stigma to therapy. And, you know, most of the therapists, most psychologists, most people in the mental health field were white.
Oh,
And
totally. Yeah.
you didn't see people of color. Now that's changed over time. And, you know, because of that, I'm really kind of curious about your experience going through training and learning about the human psyche and whether or not your experience, you felt like, you know, the experience of somebody of color or the experience of marginalized communities, if they were really encompassed in your training and if they were taken into account when talking about human experience.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Every single faculty member of my program was white. And we had like a one elective multicultural counseling course. My cohort was actually fairly diverse. There was, you know, several people of the global majority, and like I felt like I had the ability to like toggle, you know, like being Asian, it's like white adjacent enough, so I can hang out with the white people, but like still a person of color, so I can hang out with the brown people. And it, you know, it was a lot of like being a social chameleon. And honestly, during grad school, like I was not aware, or like I had not really started my own liberation journey in earnest. Like that was something that I really pursued post graduation after 2016, when I was like, oh wow, like so much has risen to the surface. And that was when I like deep dived into it. And like thank God, because I think it would have made grad school even more miserable. Like it's already such a survival thing, you know, it's so hard.
Yes.
And then to, you know, have to be aware of the layers of like microaggressions and, you know, lack of opportunity and just like the insults of that experience would have been more miserable. So, but yes, there was not any sort of like true inclusivity, diversity, or like consideration of like power differentials with really much of anything other than just like therapist versus client.
Sure. You know, it's funny. I'm curious, when did you actually graduate with your degree? What year did you graduate?
Yeah, December of 2015, and then I had a postdoc year, and then I became fully licensed in February of 2017.
Wow. So
Mm-hmm.
basically what I'm struck by is there's probably roughly around 20-25 years difference between you and me and our experience. And what I'm
Yeah.
struck by is it doesn't sound like it was much different after 25 years, which is a little concerning,
No.
you know,
Yeah.
and my graduate school experience was very similar as well. As one, first of all, it was even though there wasn't a lot of diversity in the graduate student population, it was a very homogenized kind of experience. And you're right, graduate school is really tough. I don't know what your experience was. It
So
wasn't,
tough.
yeah, it wasn't tough academically. It was tough because you felt like you were always under a microscope,
Yep.
you know, and
Yep.
you were always being questioned. I mean, there was this
Yep.
questioning of, you know, your sense of reality. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there were times, I think you made a really good point is, you know, you actually appreciate the fact that you didn't do your own personal liberation
Yeah.
journey until after graduate school,
Yeah.
because it probably would have made the experience even more hellacious.
Yep.
So you get out of graduate school, it's a very homogenized experience. There's not a lot of, other than your elective course of multicultural diversity. And by the
One.
way, I also had the one course as well. it sounds like it's one of those experiences where you just get what you need to get out of the experience and
Hmm.
then you go on your way and then you find yourself, right? You
Yeah,
find
D for
yourself.
done.
Yeah, right. D for done. And then, okay, I can decide what is useful in this experience and take with me. And now I'm going to discover or I'm going to create what makes sense for me and works for me. Now, you said something that was really fascinating to me, and I'd love to hear more about it. You said, it wasn't until after graduate school that I started my own liberation journey. I'm curious
Hmm.
about that word and that phrasing. Tell
Yeah.
me tell me what that means and also what did that look like for you personally?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about, liberation, you start like questioning one system of power and oppression, and you start like tugging on that thread. You realize like they're all related. You pull on one thread, and before you know it, the whole tapestry unravels. And that's really what the liberation journey has been like for me. Because when I started my private practice, it was right after I got licensed, and it was right after Trump 1.0's inauguration. And I'm in
Oh,
the
okay.
city. Austin's pretty white, but there's a lot of pockets of people of color who don't really have community with each other. And so my practice very quickly filled with like highly anxious, overthinking overachievers, which is, my niche. But they were a lot of them were children of immigrants, like had that immigrant mentality, had that, all the like internalized capitalism that comes along with trying to mask and survive as a person of color in these systems. And so they would come in for like anxiety and perfectionism, and we'd like address those symptoms. And before we know it, be like, oh no, this is complex trauma. And like everybody had some version of like, family of origins things, like a lot to unlearn, a lot to like deconstruct and decolonize. So, it started off like with like mostly anti-racism work. And then it was like, oh, okay, gender, sexuality, different facets of identity. And, in that process, I was also going through like my own liberation journey with my relationships, where I was opening up my relationship and like coming into my queerness as like a late blooming queer. And so it was all very much tied together of like everything's kind of made up, like all these rules, systems, like why does love have to be like this? Why does relationships have to be like this? What is the institution of structure that says we have to operate in this way? And what happens if we don't, and we get to design something that works better for us and what we want and our values?
Great. Yeah. How did you get to that point? Meaning, okay, so you go out into your own private practice, you start working with, high achievers that are highly anxious, and you say that you start to uncover, oh wow, this is really trauma, or oh my
Hmm.
goodness, this is racism, or this is oppression, or this is just somebody trying to make it and belong. What was it in your own journey, as well
Hmm.
as what you've experienced in your client's journey, that took you to that direction, that this was complex trauma, that this was racism, that this was oppression, and then the questioning of all of our social rules.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so around that same time, it was maybe about a year or a half later, I
Mhm.
also became voluntold to be the admin of our local mental health professionals Facebook group, because there was like an act of racism that really splintered the group. And it was around like Mandarin speaking therapists, and I was like the only one in all of the city. I mean, it's not the case anymore, but I was one of very few. And so like I said something, and then like people spoke up and it's like, the way that like this group is being moderated, it's really like oppressive for, racial trauma and experiences of more systemic trauma. And then like the group shut down. It was like a whole explosion. And then when we reformed, like I, put together this mod team, and then like, we worked on just like having a more anti-oppressive, anti-racist space explicitly, for the next several years. And that really helped me like develop my voice and like learn about community organizing. And like, I was also doing like a ton of trainings at that time around more embodied somatic practices, like more more like dynamic rooted, attachment oriented interventions, but also like undoing racism with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Like I was doing a lot of like racial awareness, racial literacy types of trainings too. And so like really learning from that perspective, like that was my was like anti-racism. And then from there, like expanding beyond like, you can't just be selective, right? You can't just say like, oh, this is the one identity that like deserves, equity, but all the other ones don't, it's like a rising tides raises all ships, and you have to stand for justice and equity for all people if you're going to actually promote collective liberation. So that was, so that was my initial learning of all the theory. And then from there, like trying to work with people individually and developing more of like a practice, clinically with it, but then also like a praxis in my life with it. Like, how do I embody this in everything that I do, in all my relationships, in the way that I approach the world?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's a couple things coming to mind as you're sharing this, Dr. Ren. One of the things is, you speak about these concepts, anti-racism, oppression, liberation. I want to get a little granular here.
Yeah.
Like, what would this actually look like in the therapy room? Like, if you're working with a client and you're addressing some of these struggles, what would that actually look like?
Yeah. So like a lot of times people come in and they're like, okay, my boss is saying I need to do this at work. And like, I feel like I have such an imposter syndrome. I don't know if I'm doing enough. And like, I need to just like work later. And, I think more traditional interventions might be like, oh, okay, well, how do you time block and like prioritize? And, are you taking time to like go exercise in the morning? Or, how do you like cope with these demands? Whereas like from this perspective, is like, who benefits from you overworking? What does this do for the system? And how do you want to show up in your life and in the system? So it's like challenging people to consider the power dynamics that are always at play, and then using that as a way to like reconsider someone's self-concept. Like, where did you learn that? Where did you learn that this is what you need to do to earn value, earn worth? Do you really have to prove yourself constantly, or is there something more innate to what you are and who you can be without having to perform? What are the areas in your life that you're masking and performing versus just like allowing yourself to be authentic? So really helping people notice and challenge the power dynamics. A lot of times people come in and they're like, well, I'm probably just being too sensitive, but like someone said this to me. And so like recognize like maybe you're not being too sensitive, and that it was actually really microaggressive and it's actually racist and you deserve to be upset about it. So I feel like there's a lot of individualism in traditional psychotherapy that really, helps people cope with the systems that exist. And like, yes, that is still necessary because we have to live in this, right? This is what we depend on. But how do you also begin to poke holes in, the validity of this system, and, how much of it we have to just really roll over and perform for?
Right. As you open up the door to some really important kind of pivots with this, and some interesting conversations around this. One of the things that I'm thinking about is, I can say this from my perspective, Dr. Ren, is that sometimes I feel like I straddle worlds, meaning obviously I am a person of color, I'm queer, and by the way, I'm also a fellow late bloomer. So I'll just share that with you.
It.
And I think who we are and how we discover who we are is really a journey that never ends, right? And I think about my earlier experiences. First of all, I came into the world right smack in the civil rights movement. I was born in 1965, just literally a couple of years after desegregation of schools, and so I was just born into this. And
Mm-hmm.
my father, being a Latino, obviously Latino, a very big man that brought lots of attention to himself just because of the way he looked. He raised us. He raised us to be ashamed of who we were.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't acknowledge our ethnicity. We didn't acknowledge,
Mm-hmm.
our
Mm-hmm.
identities, and instead, I think about my own experience as a child, as a young adult, is I didn't want to call attention to myself. I felt like
Mm-hmm.
inherently, I felt like there was something wrong with me,
Yeah.
that I didn't fit in
Yeah.
because what I was
Yeah.
seeing around me didn't make sense. Like it wasn't my world, but I also didn't feel like I was in a place, or I didn't feel like I had the voice to speak up because I
Mm-hmm.
was told you need to fit in. You
Yep.
need to be like everybody else. And so I wonder how often, I wonder what your own experience was around that, and also your experience with your clients, that they don't
Mm-hmm.
even consider that there's a problem with the system. Oftentimes they say there's a problem with me,
Yep. Because that's what we're
right?
told. That's what we're
Yes.
told. Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. I also grew up in the predominantly white space, and it was, I guess, more diverse than some places. I grew up in a college town. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But it was predominantly white. At least, the cultural values were very much of whiteness, because the people of color were also immigrants, which in a lot of ways immigrants embody white supremacy culture to the max, because that is what they know in terms of what's going to help them survive and what's going to put food on the table. It's like, how do we contort ourselves to like fit in so we can get our needs met? And that was really the priority growing up. And I remember as a child, like, some of my Asian friends would like have mostly Asian. I had a lot of Asian friends too, but like my reputation was that, oh, Han is the banana. Han's the banana of the group. Yellow on the outside, white on the inside, because that was what I knew. Like, I learned to fawn and people please so early, just as a way to survive within my own family of origin and out in the world. And I saw it, from my parents. And so much of my experience was like, okay, this is what it's going to take for me to survive. And it's not until I like checked off a lot of these like life boxes that were, that afforded me security and safety, that I even had the space to explore what's beyond box checking. Who am I? What do I actually want? And what do I actually believe in? What are my values? And, you could hold like kind of justice oriented values and then still feel so oppressed and constricted by the system that you don't get to embody them. It is a privilege to be able to heal and to be able to, be an advocate for others, because it means you have some sense of internal safety, whether that translates to external or like privilege and power, that varies, but you have to have that internal embodied safety in order to like be able to live to those values even.
That's a good point. I mean, you're talking about this fine line between owning who you are, being proud of who you are, living authentically who you are. Yet it bumps up against this very, very primal need as a human, and that safety
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
survival, and kind of straddling those fences. I think about my own experience, and I'm just kind of reflecting on it, and I will tell you that I don't think I really acknowledged, just even publicly, like I didn't own my own brownness. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously I'm Latina. Obviously I have a Latina name. But when
Yeah.
I think about my journey, it was almost like it was just some part of me that I just didn't pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
was like, I think for me, what I did, in terms of trying to assimilate into the white culture, is that I identified with the parts of me that were acceptable: being a
Mm-hmm.
woman, being a
Yep.
psychologist,
Yep.
being a middle class citizen,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. I was invited to write a chapter in a book called Latina Radiance. And I
Mm.
wrote this chapter, and it wasn't until this chapter that I wrote this chapter that it dawned on me. It was like, oh my goodness, I experienced a lot of racism And I
Yeah.
didn't realize it. My own personal experience was my father buying our first home.
Hmm.
I was 4 years old. As any 4-year-old kid's going to do, you're in your new house and you start looking for friends. Well, I
Hmm.
walk up the street about 4 or 5 houses up the block, and there's this little girl in the lawn playing, a little
Hmm.
white girl, and I go up to play with her, and we're playing. And
Hmm.
all of a sudden, her mother storms out of the door. I
Yeah.
mean, storms
Oh,
with this
damn.
horrified look, grabs her daughter, picks her up, and
Mm,
runs in the house. Well, I
it's
didn't
brutal.
understand.
Yeah, of course
So
not.
I went home. I went home crying, and I told my mother. Now here's the funny story. So I am bi-ethnic. My mother is white.
Hmm.
My father
Hmm.
was Latino. So my mother, being a little bit of her mama bear, picks me up and just storms up the street, and just knocks on this door, pounds on the door. And the
Gosh.
woman answers the door, and her mouth just drops because, first of all, she doesn't understand. Here I am, this little brown girl. And when I was
Yeah. With
little,
a
I was a
white
lot,
mom.
yeah, I was a
Yeah.
lot browner as a little girl because I was out
Yeah.
in the sun. And so that was my first experience. What was more subtle, and actually I recognized really damaging,
Mm,
Dr. Wren, was I was put in the back of the classrooms.
mm,
I was ignored.
yeah.
When I asked questions, I was being oppositional or defiant.
Hmm. Hmm.
I went all the way through high school. I was a very bright student, not acknowledged,
Hmm.
not recognized. Nobody talked to me about college, even though I was a straight A student.
Yeah.
And none of this stuff really registered until I started writing this article, this
Wow.
chapter. And it was like, holy cow. And you wonder, I sat with, how did this affect what I believed about myself?
Hmm.
Like, how did
Hmm.
this affect my own sense of self?
Yeah.
And I can say that how it affected me was I had that just kind of slippery feeling of there's something wrong with me.
Yep. Yep.
There's
I'm the
something wrong.
problem.
I am the
Hmm.
problem. I am the problem. And it isn't until recently that I've owned my brownness. But
Yep.
along with that, and you had made a mention of this, and I want to pivot a little bit, is
Hmm.
who we are is complex, right?
Yep.
I've heard you refer to us as having hyphenated identities.
Yeah,
We
totally.
have these intersectional identities.
Hmm.
And just as we started our conversation today as an immigrant, you're an
Hmm.
immigrant. You've got that. You've got a language, difference in language.
Yep.
Difference in ethnicity, difference in generation. All these different identities, being queer, being woman, all of these things. And I'm
Hmm.
curious. How do you approach that? How do you address this idea of hyphenated identities in the work that you do?
Yeah. It's so interesting because we're really feeling a cultural pendulum with this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, post George Floyd, there was this big, I mean, we all knew, but now it's confirmed, like this performative allyship, this like visibility, embracing of diversity. And then like really right now we're feeling the crushing backlash of that. And the way that, like illegal DEI, like whatever that means, this attempt at erasure and this attempt at homogenizing society in ways that will never work, and it's just like frankly anti-science and anti everything we know about how people experience belonging and the world. And so it's going to exist. We're going to have these hyphenated lives, and how we approach it is going to be kind of in response or reaction to what is safe for us to express, from a cultural societal level. I think, no matter who we are, it's so important that we find like the authentic spaces, like truly deeply fullest expression authentic spaces with people who will allow and accept and celebrate every single dimension of us. And maybe those communities may be smaller, but part of having this hyphenated identity is we are skilled at code switching and masking and toggling and being social chameleons. And when it comes to survival, that might be something we need to consider more, because it's not going to be safe for us to be at our fullest expression everywhere. And it's going to cause a lot of psychological harm and possibly physical harm because of how our society is in this current stage. But I also trust that it is a giant pendulum, and we are going to swing back the other way. Culturally, we are at probably the most liberated times, and people don't know what to do with that, right? So there's this like collective backlash and attempt to return to more controlled, simpler ways of being. But that's also grasping at just the liberated expression of humanity that people feel out of control with.
Yeah. This is an interesting time. I think it's interesting that when you graduated from graduate school, Trump was in office, and now we're here again. And these things that we're talking about, and I'm gonna bring it kind of to a personal level. In 2024 is the time that I came out. And 2024 is when I owned my identity as a queer person. And I want to talk about this a little bit, because I think this is important. I'm hoping it will be helpful to the listeners. Is I struggled with the boxes that were available to me, as a young person, like, for example, and again, this is not to say that, this is not a negative commentary about labels. I never identified with the label lesbian. I did not. It did not feel right. It felt like, the wrong size shoe. It just didn't feel right. And yet that was the box I was given. And, it wasn't until last year. And I love this. I love, the generational things, because, my son and I had these conversations, and, he identified as queer. And I'm like, well, talk to me about that, because when I was young, queer was not a positive. It was not a term, and it was not a positive thing. And so, we had this wonderful conversation about it. And it was like, oh, okay. I've been enlightened here. I'm queer. It made sense to me. And because I didn't want to be in a box, because I didn't want somebody else to define who I was or what I wanted to experience in life. And so, I love the label, because it does give you the freedom. I think when we think about liberation, what's the other side of that coin? Freedom to choose who we are. And so last year I came out brown, proud, queer.
Love it.
And then look what happened. We have, I call it the slingshot effect. Before 2025, our culture, we were getting into a place, as you said, the most free we've ever been, the most liberated we've been. People were being embraced for who they were, based, whatever their gender identification was, whatever their sexual orientation was, whatever their religious or spiritual affiliation was, whatever their color, their skin was. And it was a great time. It was feeling good. And now with the slingshot effect, we're getting we got the pullback, and boom, we got snapped, and we're getting into this place. Yes. And I'm curious, let's bring it to present time. What do you suggest? Because there is this line between being authentic, being proud of who you are, owning who you are, but also being careful, because I think what's happening right now is, given some of the rhetoric, given some of the things that are happening, I think it's giving our culture permission. It's giving permission to get into aggressive kinds of stances toward people who are different.
Yes,
and people are getting pushed back into margins. And I'm curious what you do with that right now, today.
Yeah. I think this is when the role of art and creativity is so powerful. Because if you look at some of the biggest artists right now and the way that they use their platform and use their voice, it's so inspiring. Like I'm thinking like Chappell Roan, right? Like she has this new song called The Giver. It's about eating pussy and it's really popular. And she's a lesbian drag queen. Then totally celebrated, right? That's
Right.
beautiful. And the ways that like culture embraces that, right? Because it's inherently political, but it's also like catchy and poppy. And then you look at Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl performance,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that was so powerful. And like if you didn't get it, it made you really uncomfortable and you didn't quite know why. But if you got it, it was like deeply affirming and encouraging. And so I really feel like we're in a moment of time where it's like we're going to keep doing what we're doing and saying what we're saying, but we're going to kind of shape shift a little bit. And we have our marching orders: say what you need to say and keep your job. And I think there are people who are going to say like, well, that's selling out, and that's like not like open enough, but like that's also a privilege. Not everyone has the ability to be that out and loud and proud without like having some serious safety survival backlash. And so I don't think that's something that any of us get to gatekeep for another person. We're all moving in the same direction in the lane that fits best for us, and we can figure out how to do this in a way that will also allow us to stay relatively safe. I don't think you have to be at your fullest expression all the time in order to be authentic.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to be having this conversation, Dr. Wren, because what comes to my mind is, isn't it crazy? Isn't it crazy to think that who we are is political? Like,
Oh,
I mean, in terms of our identities, it's political.
of course.
How in the world is who we are become? How did it become political? It's
But it was
crazy.
always political. It was always political because when you're making policies that determine a person's right to access healthcare related to their bodies, like that is inherently political. When you are determining what quote unquote merit looks like, right? And you don't consider the history and the structural barriers that even allow someone's resume to be presented to a hiring manager. Like these are inherently tied to our lived experiences and our identities, and they have always been political. But we have always accepted and normalized that that's just how things are. Some people have more opportunities, and you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But you know it's the system. The system is designed in a way that gives some people a head start and then like propels them forward while others are really behind and kept behind. And that's what maintains this division of structural power in our society. And then when it comes down to it, like you cannot challenge racism without challenging capitalism, right? Because they are so inherently tied, and capitalism requires haves and have-nots. And what is the easiest way to discern that, right? By our appearances. And like tribalism is a very human thing, and it happens all over the world, and it's part of how we have learned to survive. But it's a matter of how do we know this about us and then still work towards establishing policies, values, and norms that allow us to have more equity.
Right. Right. Yeah. I want to follow up on something that you said about
Mm,
our entertainment industry. That
yeah.
you're looking at, some of the statements, very profound statements that are made through artists' expressions. And
Mhm.
I want to shift gears a little bit, because right alongside that, and whether we consider it entertainment or something else, is social media.
Yep.
And social media has become quite a far-reaching platform. It's
Totally.
international, right?
Yeah.
And it's you can look at it. It's also very multifaceted. You can look at
Mm-hmm.
it as a form of entertainment, and you can look at it as a form of information, or you can look at it as a platform for taking stances against things. And one of the things that I wonder about is I'm thinking about, the 60s were known for political marches, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
protests. And it seems like today, it seems like political marches and protests are ineffective. They're
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ineffective. They're just not,
Yeah.
at least it's seemingly so. It doesn't seem like it's creating change. And so what
Right.
I'm wondering about is, and I know that you have a pretty strong social media
Mm-hmm.
presence, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about your intent with that. And,
Yeah.
what's its purpose for you, and what are you
Mm.
trying to accomplish with your social media presence, particularly in today's climate?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that has evolved so much for me because I've been doing this for what, 4.5 years. And it really started out as like a pandemic boredom buster. Like, what am I doing with my time? I'm at home all the time, and it was a way to channel some creativity. And my initial stance with it was there was a lot of mental health content in early COVID days, but it was all pretty generic and like, 5 signs you have depression. And it was not really tailored to people of the global majority. And it was not really considering, elements of power and identity and marginalizing, like all these things that like affect the mental health of marginalized people. And I really wanted to, give psychology away for free and like make it more accessible for people who really was struggling and did not have the means to like go see a therapist themselves. But even that has really taken on its own you know dark side, right? Like the weaponization of therapy speak and like how people, think that they can diagnose themselves with anything and everything because they saw someone on TikTok talking about it. And I have really even like departed from that where I don't talk about, symptoms of much because I don't want people to mistake social media content as therapy or professional mental health intervention. Um, and then, beyond that, it's really learning how to use your voice in a way that can move the needle. I think I've given up on trying to like, speak on every topic, right? Because I'm not an expert on every topic and I don't need to like add my voice to something that I know not that much about. And so my platform now is mostly therapists. A lot of therapists follow me to get, different ideas about working with their clients. I do a lot of workshops and trainings and consultations with people based on my professional experience and my lived experience. And I really think of it as, one of many pieces in this greater voice of how do we affect cultural change and sustain cultural change. But it's scary. It's scary because of the ways that like people have been targeted for having a voice, and just like these algorithms and these platforms are controlled by people with agendas that align themselves to power. So, they're able to shadow ban certain types of perspectives or deplatform people. And so it's become a really fraught landscape. And I'm not at a place where I'm jumping ship or like just, going to Patreon or Substack like a lot of people are. But I've definitely slowed down on my content creation, and I've had to be a lot more thoughtful about like how do I use my voice and where do I put my creative energy.
It's it's a evolutionary process personally, right?
Totally.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. You say, okay, I started this kind of in the pandemic, and where I started and where I am now has really changed. I mean, we grow.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is, we can kind of look at the lens here. We can zoom out and we can zoom in. And if we zoom really, really far into the microscopic, we look at you as a person. We look at
Hmm.
myself as a person, and our
Yeah.
own growth and our own evolution. You and I have some overlap in our interests. I
Hmm.
started a podcast a year ago. I started social media posting and doing a blog for the very same reason that you did. And that is, I wanted to have this be accessible to anybody, because at the end of the day, I mean, if we really think about this, at the end of the day, psychology, therapy, coaching, it's for the privileged. It's for people who,
Totally.
because it's expensive and it's not accessible to a lot of
Yep.
people. And yet we can use this platform. You said something that caught my attention. You like, I just want to move the needle. If I can just move the
Hmm.
needle, it's a very powerful platform. I'm
Yeah.
curious because I don't want to make assumptions, Dr. Wren.
Hmm.
Where are you moving the needle to? Like, if you're successful with your
Hmm.
platform, what are you trying to accomplish right now in
Yeah.
moving that needle?
I want people to know that, like, no, regardless of what this administration says and the policies that make certain types of self-expression illegal, or it's no one's illegal. No human experience is illegal. You can't, just because you say it's illegal doesn't make it illegal. It doesn't abolish it, right? Like, look at the war on drugs. Like, it's I want people to know that, like, we're still out here. We're still fighting. We're still existing. And, like, part of what, demonstrates our success is, like, the joy and the rest and the liberation. Like, we get to experience the full spectrum of our lives beyond just suffering and resistance and the fight. And I think living well is always the best revenge. And so, how do we coast for a while and, like, exist and form smaller communities and, like, do this in a way that allows us to have some relative peace during a time of huge turmoil and uncertainty, and come out the other side. And, I get a lot of, DMs and messages from people who are just like, wow, this one video really spoke to me because of, like, the very hyper specific, nuanced elements that you covered here. And I think that, to me, is so meaningful when people, share, like, the ways that they see themselves in my content, or the way that they feel so um, seen and validated based on, these little esoteric bits that I share. And maybe that's enough for now. Like, we're not going to be able to have more, I guess, like, institutionally funded or, like, platformed experiences probably for the next 4 years. But, like, that doesn't mean we don't have, smaller communities that are forming, and, like, groups of very dedicated, passionate people who still really want to see this rhetoric and these ideas proliferate and survive the next 4 years and beyond.
Right, right. You know, we do these things. We get involved. We have our own values. We have our own intent in terms of what we're
Hmm.
trying to do in terms of bringing good into the world. Right? We all have our personal versions of that, and also our personal experiences and our personal growth points around that. I'm
Hmm.
curious. You know, people today are getting to hear about the things that you stand for and the things that you help others with, and the ways in which you're trying, as you said, to move the needle in our culture. I'm really curious about what your own personal journey's been like.
Mm.
How does your personal journey mirror or parallel the things that you talk about?
Yeah. I mean, so much of my personal journey is embodying who I am and
Mhm.
having the permission and the freedom and, changing my own life structures to allow for more fuller expression, right? Whether it's racially or through my healing work or through my relationships. Like in the past, gosh, 10 years, that has been such an incredible journey for me because I went from, okay, we got to like do traditional Eurocentric psychotherapy in these, boxes to like, okay, I get to like have a practice that I design and, pick a healing modality that resonates, that's aligned to my personality and like how I imagine healing to occur, and then engaging in my own, individual personal therapy this whole time and like discovering, what it means to take up more space. And then through there, like, okay, how do I examine this in my relationships? What would it mean to actually embody some of my queerness that I didn't even recognize until recently? And then like, living full polyamorous lives and doing that in an out loud kind of way that's pretty public and modeling for people like, yeah, you can be a polyamorous mom and be a damn good mom and not be like deviant or socially, screwy, and the stigma that people still perceive about some of these things. You can be professional, you can be playful, like all of these parts can coexist. And I feel like the longer I'm on this journey, the more integration I have. I don't feel like I have to, have compartmentalized parts of myself that's come out only in certain times when it's, you know, acceptable. Although, I mean, I will say in the past few months, that has been more of a thought of like, okay, how do I toggle these? But I think, being able to access and embody these parts of yourself is a key part of learning how to toggle, because then you know what it feels like to be fully expressed in some spaces and then, more survival and muted in other spaces. And that's a tool in your toolbox that you get to utilize. So it's definitely been a journey, especially in the past few months of, reckoning with what does our context and environment and society looks like at this point.
Right, right. And that's a real thing too. I mean, the real thing being that you do have the freedom to express, and it's also important to not be naive
Yeah.
and believe that you're going to be completely okay and protected, because there is a lot of backlash. And I sit with this whole, I don't know, I struggle to even find the words for this, is this need for control and power over. I mean, as humanity, I mean, this isn't just in the American culture. I think
it's global.
This is global, and this is since humankind, right? It's humankind. Is what is this need? What is this need to keep people controlled and in boxes and behaving a particular way? And what's the cost of that? Like, can you imagine a world in which we were all fully expressed? I mean, I don't even think we have the language for it.
Yeah.
It's never happened. I mean, can you imagine that?
Yeah, I mean, and like to do that in a way that still maintains like some societal order and structure of like kindness and like, not taking advantage, like, like not like the dark sides of humanity like take over. Yeah, like that's wild to imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we need to close here real soon. I'm curious, like, what do you want to leave the listeners? Like, what is most important to you? Like, I think about things like, for example, for myself, and it's interesting, we've had this conversation today in a very different way, but this idea of power, and we really struggle with what that is. And, there's a dark side to power, and there's also a light side to power that, at the end of the day, that's really what we're wanting. We want our own personal power to be, to have, to do what's important to us. Right. And it's also something that can be really misused.
Yeah,
and it can
yeah.
cause harm. And I know that for
Mm-hmm.
me, that's the thing that I really think is important. And if I were to say what's my message, it's about claiming our personal power
Mm-hmm.
and doing it for good. And I'm curious, like what you think your message is. Like, what do you want to leave the listeners?
Yeah. I mean, I think about this more in terms of agency, right? Like
Hmm.
agency is like power with,
Hmm.
it's curiosity. And, I think so much of the misuse of power we're seeing is this power over, this desire to control people's experiences and to dominate and to, you know, shove into boxes that which we do not understand.
Hmm.
And it's scary when people are embodying things that we can't even imagine for ourselves. And so, I say this all the time that like liberation has to start with within. Whatever's happening out there is happening in here. And we can only meet others as deeply as we have met ourselves. And so that is such a, core of power for me, is this ability to be curious about your own reactions and your own experiences and sit with it and slow down and to metabolize and integrate it to a place where you can have less judgment for yourself, which translates to less judgment for others. The more we can be compassionate with ourselves, the more compassionate and empathetic we are with other people's experiences, even of just, you know, suffering that we don't understand. We can still connect with that emotional experience or the felt sense of, suffering that other people are experiencing and wish them well. And so I think, at the end of the day, I just really want people to stay curious to the full range of their own experiences so they can be open-minded to seeing, accepting, and loving other people's experiences as different as they may be from ours. And, part of that for me these days is like, okay, I'm going to sit with and try to talk to people on the other side of the political spectrum for me. And sometimes that's really hard, but I think, even like no matter where we are on the spectrum, it can be real easy to get into this like political purity pissing contest and um, have the same process hinder our our learning and our healing, even if it's a different content.
Yeah. You know, Dr. Ren, what you've shared today it's been truly not only informational but inspirational. What I love about our conversation today is uh, your sensitivity around not only the personal,
Mm,
but the reality is we are in a bigger container. I mean,
yeah,
it's not just, it's naive to think about, oh, just focus on these things without thinking about the greater context. We
yeah,
we
yeah,
live in a society, we live in communities. And what I love about what you've shared is you've shared examples about how you navigate personal experience with social experience and how you
yeah,
do those. And I love, I mean, you've shared it with such a finesse, I'm very impressed with that. And so thank you for sharing that
thank
with
you.
us. I've really enjoyed the conversation very much today. So thank you for coming and thank you for
Yeah,
sharing your experiences. And I don't know if this is okay, but I know that you have a book coming.
yes, I
I
do.
don't know if you would like to share a little bit and give a plug
Yeah.
about your book.
Yeah, we're not quite in like pre-order season yet, but it's slated to come out summer of 2026. It's called The Hyphenated Life, surprise. And it's all about communing the in-between liminal spaces of marginalized intersectional identities. How do we show up when we feel we're too much for this space but not enough for that space? And how do we claim our own power when it comes to being authentic, even if it's not our fullest expression.
Oh my goodness. It sounds like it's going to be a great book and very helpful. The
Oh,
idea
I
of
hope
in
so.
between spaces. That's interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ren. And this is truly a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.